When my daughter Sarah got married last spring, I didn't tell her I'd inherited $9 million from her grandfather. Thank God I kept my mouth shut, because 3 weeks after the wedding, her new husband showed up at my door with a notary public, demanding I sign over everything. He had no idea who he was dealing with. I just smiled and said 6 words that made his face go white. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this all started. My name is Robert Mitchell. Folks around Sioux City call me Bob. I'm 67 years old, been retired from engineering for about 8 years now. I live in the same modest 2-bedroom house on the west side where I raised my daughter Sarah after my wife Elizabeth passed away 17 years ago. Car accident on Highway 75, black ice in February. Sarah was only 15. From that day forward, it was just the two of us against the world. My father, George Mitchell. He stepped in during those dark months. Took us fishing on the Missouri River every Saturday. Taught Sarah how to play chess in his den while I worked double shifts to keep the lights on. He was a quiet man, my dad. Made his money slow and steady, investing in properties around Woodbury County when nobody else saw the potential. He never flaunted it, never drove fancy cars or wore expensive suits. He just lived simple and saved smart. Last November, Dad passed away at 80 years old. The lawyer called me into his office in December, handed me an envelope. Inside was a number that made my hands shake. $9 million. Properties, stocks, bonds, all of it carefully built over 50 years. But along with that envelope came a letter in Dad's handwriting. It said something I'll never forget. Robert, money doesn't build character. It reveals it. Hide this inheritance until you know the truth about the people around you. I learned that lesson the hard way. Don't let Sarah learn it the same way I did. I didn't understand what he meant. Not until I met Brandon Cole. It was a cold Tuesday night in January 2024 when Sarah dropped the bomb on me. I was sitting in my armchair reading the Sioux City Journal when she walked in without knocking, something she hadn't done since she was a teenager. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold. But her eyes were bright with excitement. Dad, I need to tell you something. I'm getting married. His name is Brandon Cole. I set down the paper slowly. Married? Sarah, you've only known this guy. For what, 9 months? She crossed her arms. 10 months. And yes, married. He proposed last weekend at Stone State Park. It was beautiful, Dad. He's successful, he's confident, and he loves me. You'll love him too once you get to know him. But I already knew him. We'd had dinner together twice. The first time was at a steakhouse downtown. Brandon showed up in a $600 suit. Driving a brand new Mercedes. He shook my hand too hard, smiled too wide. When the waitress brought the wrong appetizer, he snapped his fingers at her like she was a servant. Then he spent 20 minutes talking about his real estate deals, how much commission he'd made, how he was going to triple his income next year. When I mentioned I'd worked as a civil engineer for 33 years, he smirked. Engineering, huh? That's a stable field. Not much growth potential though. I stuck with real estate because that's where the real money is. Sarah didn't seem to notice. She was too busy staring at him like he'd hung the moon. But I noticed. I noticed how his eyes scanned our neighborhood when he dropped her off, lingering on the small houses and old cars. I noticed how he asked questions. So Bob, you own this place outright? No mortgage? And your dad, George, he passed recently, right? Did he leave much behind? I brushed it off the first time. Maybe he was just making conversation. But the second dinner confirmed my suspicions. Brandon brought his mother, Margaret Cole. She was a sharp-looking woman in her early 60s, dressed head to Toe in designer labels. She looked at my house like it was a condemned building. Sarah dear, she said with a thin smile, once you and Brandon are married, you'll move into something more suitable. Something that reflects your new status. That night, after they left, I tried talking to Sarah. Honey, I don't trust him. He's too focused on money, on status. Have you noticed how he talks about people? How he treats waiters and cashiers? She exploded. Oh my God, Dad, you're being ridiculous. You're just jealous because I'm finally building my own life. Mom's been gone for 17 years. I can't live in this little house forever, worrying about you being alone. Brandon is good for me. He's ambitious. He's going places. And whether you like it or not, I'm marrying him in March. She grabbed her coat and stormed out. The door slammed so hard it rattled the picture frames on the wall. One of them, a photo of me, Sarah, and Elizabeth from 2006, tipped over and cracked. I stood there in the silence, staring at that broken frame. And that's when I heard my father's voice in my head. Hide this inheritance until you know the truth about the people around you. I walked to my bedroom, pulled open the closet, and retrieved the lockbox from the top shelf. Inside was the envelope from the lawyer. $9 million. I hadn't told Sarah yet. I was waiting for the right time. But now, looking at that number, I realized something. If Brandon knew about this money, he wouldn't just be pushy. He'd be dangerous. I locked the box and shoved it back into the closet. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I got down on my knees beside my bed and prayed. God, if this man is real, show me. And if he's not, give me the strength to protect my little girl. 2 days later, I called Sarah. I apologized. I told her I'd be at the wedding, that I'd support her decision. She cried with relief. Oh Dad, thank you. I knew you'd come around. You're going to see. Brandon is the best thing that ever happened to me. I hung up the phone and stared out the window at the snow-covered street. I wasn't coming around. I was buying time. Because if Brandon Cole was after my family's money, I needed to catch him red-handed before he got his claws into Sarah for good. And the only way to do that was to let him think we had nothing worth taking. The wedding was set for March 16, 2024, at a venue overlooking the Missouri River in downtown Sioux City. I'll admit, it was beautiful. White flowers everywhere. String lights hanging from the rafters, about 100 guests dressed in their Sunday best. But the whole time I stood there in my plain gray suit, I felt like I was watching my daughter walk into a trap. Sarah looked stunning in her wedding dress. For a moment, when she took my arm to walk down the aisle, I saw her mother in her smile. My chest tightened. Elizabeth would have known what to say. To talk sense into her. But Elizabeth was gone, and I was on my own. I walked Sarah down that aisle, shook Brandon's hand, and took my seat in the front row. The ceremony was quick. The preacher said his piece, they exchanged vows, and just like that, Sarah became Sarah Cole. When Brandon kissed her, he held on a little too long, a little too possessive. I saw the way his hand gripped her waist like she was property he'd just acquired. At the reception, I tried to blend in. The food was good, prime rib and mashed potatoes, local stuff. But I couldn't shake the feeling in my gut. I watched Brandon work the room like a politician, shaking hands, slapping backs, laughing too loud. And then I noticed something. Every time he talked to someone, he'd steer the conversation toward me. That's my father-in-law, Bob Mitchell. Yeah, his dad just passed. George Mitchell owned a bunch of properties around the county. Bob's being modest about the inheritance. My jaw tightened. I hadn't said a word about inheritance. Where was he getting that? Then I saw Margaret. She was standing near the bar, talking to a man I didn't recognize. He was holding a briefcase, wearing a cheap suit that didn't match the wedding's dress code. I drifted closer, pretending to grab a drink, and caught pieces of their conversation. By next month, Margaret was saying, "Once we establish joint assets, we'll need you to notarize the transfer. Make sure it's dated before the wedding. That way it's airtight." The man nodded. 5,000, like we discussed. Margaret slipped him an envelope. "Half now. Half when it's done." My blood ran cold. I turned away before they saw me, my heart pounding in my chest. They were already planning to forge documents. I pulled out my phone and texted my old friend Jim, a family lawyer I'd known for 20 years. "Need to see you Monday. Urgent. Can't talk now." Later, during the toasts, I stood up with my glass of champagne. I kept it short. To Sarah and Brandon. May your marriage be built on honesty, loyalty, and respect. Sarah deserves nothing less. The room clapped politely. But when I sat down, Brandon leaned over from the head table and raised his glass toward me with a smirk. "Don't worry, Bob. I'll take real good care of your daughter. And everything that comes with her. Everything that comes with her." The words echoed in my head like a threat. After dinner, I stepped outside for air. The March wind off the river was cold, but it cleared my head. I stood on the balcony overlooking the water, and that's when I heard it. Brandon's voice, just around the corner, talking on his phone. "Yeah, Mom's got the notary lined up. Once we get access to the old man's estate, we're set. Sarah doesn't suspect a thing. She thinks this is about love." He laughed, low and cruel. "Give it 3 months. We'll have the paperwork, file for divorce. And walk away with half of everything. Maybe more if we play it right." I stood frozen, my hands gripping the railing so hard my knuckles went white. There it was. Confirmation. This wasn't a marriage. It was a heist. I thought back to 3 months earlier. November 23, 2023. My father's hospital room at Mercy Medical Center. He was thin, frail. Hooked up to machines that beeped steadily in the quiet. I sat beside his bed, holding his hand. "Dad," I said softly, "don't try to talk. Save your strength." But he gripped my hand tighter than I expected. His voice was a raspy whisper. "Robert, listen to me. I'm leaving you everything. 9 million. Properties, investments, everything I built." I started to protest. "Dad, you don't have to explain." But he cut me off. "Yes, I do. Because I need you to promise me something. Don't tell Sarah about this money." "Not yet." I blinked. "What? Why?" His eyes, still sharp despite the pain, locked onto mine. "Because money reveals who people really are." Back in 1975, my own brother found out about a deal I'd made. $50,000, good money back then. He smiled to my face, said he was proud of me. Then he forged my signature and cleaned out the account. Nearly bankrupted me. I had to start over from nothing. I felt a chill run down my spine. "I never knew that." George nodded slowly. "I never told anyone. I was ashamed. But I learned something, Robert. When people think you're rich, they see dollar signs, not your face. Test Sarah's husband first. If he loves her without knowing about the money, he's real. If he starts sniffing around, asking questions, you'll know he's a vulture. And then you protect her. Whatever it takes." He passed away 2 hours later. Now, standing on that balcony, listening to Brandon laugh about scamming my daughter, I finally understood. My father hadn't just left me money. He'd left me a test. And Brandon Cole had just failed it spectacularly. I pulled out my phone and opened my notes app. I started typing everything I just overheard. Dates, names, the notary, Margaret's involvement. I took a photo of the man with the briefcase from across the room. Evidence. I was going to need all of it. When I walked back inside, Sarah caught my eye from the dance floor. She waved, smiling, completely unaware that her brand new husband was already planning to destroy her. I waved back, forcing a smile. Hang on, sweetheart, I thought. Your old man's got a plan. The reception wound down around midnight. Sarah and Brandon left in a shower of rice and cheers, climbing into a limo that would take them to a hotel for the night. No honeymoon yet. Brandon claimed he had big deals closing and couldn't leave town. Another red flag. I drove home alone, the streets of Sioux City empty and quiet. When I got back to my house, I went straight to the closet, pulled out the lockbox, and opened it. $9 million. My father's life's work. I ran my fingers over the papers, and I made a silent vow. Brandon Cole, you picked the wrong family to mess with. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. We know George left money. Don't play dumb. We'll get what's ours. I stared at the screen. Margaret. It had to be. I typed back 5 words. There is no money. Sorry. Then I blocked the number, locked the box, and hid it in a new spot, under a floorboard beneath my bed. Let them think I was broke. Let them think I was just a sad old man with nothing to offer. Because when they finally showed their true colors, I'd be ready. And they'd never see me coming. 3 weeks. That's all it took for Sarah's fairy tale marriage to crumble. It was April 2nd, a rainy Wednesday afternoon. I was fixing a leaky faucet in the kitchen when my phone rang. Sarah's name lit up the screen. I answered on the second ring. Hey honey. Everything okay? Silence. Then I heard it. Sobbing. Raw, broken sobs that made my heart drop into my stomach. Dad. Her voice cracked. Please come get me. I can't stay here. I need you. I didn't ask questions. I grabbed my keys, threw on my jacket, and ran to the truck. The drive to her place normally took 20 minutes. I made it in 12, rain hammering the windshield the whole way. When I pulled up to the house Brandon had rented in the suburbs, a nice 2-story with a perfect lawn, Sarah was sitting on the front porch in the rain. 2 suitcases beside her. Her hair was soaked, mascara running down her face. She looked 15 again, small and scared. I jumped out and ran to her. Sarah, what happened? She stood up and fell into my arms. He cheated. Dad. I came home early from work because I wasn't feeling well. I walked into our bedroom and there was a woman there. Some client from his office. When I confronted him, he didn't even apologize. He just laughed and said this marriage was never about love anyway. Rage boiled in my chest, but I kept my voice steady. Let's get you out of here. We loaded her suitcases into the truck. As I slammed the tailgate shut, she grabbed my arm. Dad, there's more. I found papers in his desk drawer. Divorce papers already drawn up. And files. Lots of files about Grandpa George. Property records, estate searches, bank statements. There was even a document titled Inheritance Claim Strategy. He's been investigating our family this whole time. My jaw clenched. I'd expected this, but hearing it still made my blood boil. We got in the truck and pulled away. Sarah stared out the window, shivering. On the drive back, the rain turned into a downpour. Thunder rumbled overhead. Finally, she spoke again, quieter this time. "Dad, did Grandpa leave you anything?" Brandon kept asking me. He'd say things like your grandfather owned half of Woodbury County, there's got to be money somewhere. I kept telling him we didn't have anything, but he didn't believe me. He said I was lying to protect you. I glanced at her, her face pale in the glow of the dashboard lights. I didn't answer right away. Not yet. I couldn't. Not until I knew how deep this went. We pulled into my driveway just after 6. The rain was still coming down hard. I killed the engine and turned to her. "You're safe now. We'll figure this out together." She nodded, wiping her eyes. "Thank you, Dad. I should have listened to you from the start." We got out and started unloading her suitcases. I was halfway up the porch steps when headlights swung into my driveway, blinding and aggressive. Tires screeched on the wet pavement. My heart sank. I knew exactly who it was. Brandon's Mercedes skidded to a stop inches from my mailbox. The driver's door flew open, and he jumped out, not even bothering to close it. Margaret climbed out of the passenger seat, clutching a briefcase like it was a weapon. Both of them marched toward us through the rain, faces twisted with fury. "Sarah," Brandon shouted, his voice cutting through the storm. "Get back in the car. Now. We're not done talking." I stepped in front of her, blocking his path. "Yes, you are. She's not going anywhere with you. Turn around and leave my property." He stopped a few feet away, water dripping off his expensive haircut. His eyes were wild. "You think you can just take her? We're married, old man. Legally married. She has obligations." Margaret stepped up beside him, rain bouncing off her designer coat. "And you, Robert, have obligations too. We know George left assets. We've done our research. Sarah is entitled to half of everything as Brandon's wife." I crossed my arms. "You've got no claim to anything here. Now get off my lawn before I call the police." Brandon sneered. "Call them. We've got paperwork." He gestured to the briefcase Margaret was holding. "Signed and notarized. Property transfer agreements. Sarah signed over her rights to family assets before the wedding. It's all legal." My stomach twisted, but I kept my face stone cold. "That's a lie. Sarah signed nothing." Margaret opened the briefcase and pulled out a stack of papers, waving them in the air. "Oh, but she did. We have a notary's seal and everything. So here's what's going to happen, Robert. You're going to cooperate, sign over whatever George left you, and we'll make this easy. Or we drag you through court, destroy Sarah's reputation. And take it anyway. Your choice." I looked at Brandon, then at Margaret. These people were parasites. Vultures circling what they thought was a dying man. But they'd made one critical mistake. They assumed I was weak. They assumed I had no plan. I smiled, slow and cold. "You want to go to court? Fine. See you there. Now get the hell off my property." Brandon's face turned red. "You're going to regret this." His voice was shaking with rage. "We'll bury you." I pulled out my phone. "I'm calling the sheriff. You've got 10 seconds. Margaret grabbed Brandon's arm. "Come on. Let's go. We'll handle this the legal way." They turned and stomped back to the car, slamming the doors. Brandon revved the engine and peeled out, spraying gravel and mud across my lawn. I stood there in the rain, watching the taillights disappear. Beside me, Sarah was trembling. "Dad, what are we going to do?" They have fake papers. They're going to lie in court. I put my arm around her and guided her inside. Don't worry, sweetheart. Your old man's been around long enough to know how to deal with snakes. But as I locked the door behind us, I knew the real battle was just beginning. The next morning, I woke up before dawn. Sarah was asleep on the couch, wrapped in the same quilt her grandmother had made 30 years ago. I made coffee, strong and black, and sat at the kitchen table with a notepad. If Brandon and Margaret wanted a war, I'd give them one. But I'd fight smart, the way my father taught me. First stop was my father's grave. Greenwood Cemetery. West edge of town. I parked near the big oak tree and walked across the wet grass to his headstone. George Harold Mitchell, 1943 to 2023. Beloved father and grandfather. I knelt down and brushed some leaves off the stone. Dad, I said quietly, you were right about everything. Brandon's a vulture. But I'm going to use what you left me. I'm going to protect Sarah the way you protected us. I promise. The wind rustled through the trees. For a moment, I swear I felt him there, standing beside me like he used to during those fishing trips. I stood up, squared my shoulders, and walked back to the truck. Time to get to work. By 9 a.m., I was sitting in the office of Elena Vasquez, the best family law attorney in Sioux City. Her office was downtown, 10th floor, with a view of the river. She was in her early 50s, sharp as a tack, with a reputation for eating opposing counsel alive. I'd done my research. Mr. Mitchell, she said, pouring me a cup of coffee, tell me everything. I laid it all out. The wedding, the overheard phone call, the fake notary documents, Sarah finding the divorce papers. Elena listened without interrupting, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair. This is fraud. Conspiracy to commit fraud, actually. If we can prove the notary was bribed and the documents were forged, we can get criminal charges filed. But I need evidence. Hard evidence. I pulled out my phone and showed her the photo I'd taken at the wedding. The man with the briefcase. Talking to Margaret. She zoomed in. Do you know who this is? I shook my head. Elena made a note. I'll find out. We'll need a private investigator. Someone who can dig into Brandon's background. Financial records, phone records if possible. I know a guy. Former FBI. He's expensive. I didn't blink. How expensive? She quoted a number. $30,000 retainer. I thought about the lockbox hidden under my floorboard. $9 million, untouched. I could spare $30,000. Do it, I said. Whatever it takes. She raised an eyebrow. Mr. Mitchell, forgive me for asking. But how are you planning to pay for this? You're retired, and from what you've told me, Brandon thinks you're broke. I met her eyes. Let's just say my father was a very careful man. He made provisions. I can handle the costs. You just handle Brandon. Elena smiled. I like you, Bob. Let's destroy this guy. Within 48 hours, she'd hired the investigator. His name was Ray Reyes. Late 50s, built like a bulldog, with 20 years in the bureau before he went private. We met at a diner on Gordon Drive, away from prying eyes. I slid him a folder with everything I had. Names, dates, photos, the works. Reyes flipped through it, chewing on a toothpick. This guy's sloppy, he said. Amateurs always are. Give me 2 weeks. I'll get you enough to bury him. He was true to his word. 12 days later, Reyes called me. I've got something. Meet me at the office. I drove to his place, a small storefront above a dry cleaner. He handed me a thick manila envelope. Open it. Inside were bank statements. Transfers from Margaret Cole's account to a man named David Klein. $5,000, dated March 10th. 6 days before the wedding. There were phone records too. Dozens of calls between Brandon, Margaret, and Klein in the weeks leading up to the ceremony. And then the smoking gun. An audio recording. Reyes had planted a listening device in Klein's office, completely legal under Iowa's one-party consent law since Klein's secretary had cooperated as a witness. I hit play. Brandon's voice came through, clear as day. Make it look official. Backdate the signature to March 14th. We need it to hold up in court. Klein's nasal voice responded. And the payment? Margaret's voice, cold and businesslike. 5 now. 5 after it's done. Just make sure it's notarized properly. We can't have any mistakes. I sat back, stunned. We've got them. Reyes wasn't done. I also found this. He pulled out another file. Turns out Brandon's been married twice before. Both times to women from wealthy families. Both marriages ended in messy divorces after less than a year. One of the ex-wives filed a restraining order. Claimed he harassed her family for money after the split. The case was settled out of court, records sealed. But I got a contact who remembers. She's willing to testify. I felt a grim satisfaction settling over me. How much do I owe you? Reyes waved me off. Elena's covering it. But Bob, be careful. Guys like Brandon don't go down easy. When cornered, they get desperate. He was right. That night, I got a text from an unknown number. Drop the case or we'll make Sarah's life hell. We have photos of her with another man. She'll look like the cheater. You'll both be ruined. I stared at the message. They were bluffing. They had to be. But doubt crept in. What if they'd fabricated evidence against Sarah too? I forwarded the text to Elena. Her response came immediately. Let them try. We'll add extortion to the charges. Don't engage. But the next morning, an envelope appeared on my doorstep. No stamp, hand-delivered. Inside were photos. Grainy, badly photoshopped. Images of Sarah with a man I didn't recognize. The timestamps were fake, the backgrounds poorly edited. But to an untrained eye, they might look real. My hands shook with rage. These people had no limits. I called Elena. They're trying to frame her. She sighed. Anticipated this. Get me the photos. I'll have a forensic analyst tear them apart. We'll prove they're fake and add it to the pile of evidence. Bob, we're close. Sarah's official divorce filing goes through next week. The hearing is set for May 15th. We'll have everything ready. May 15th. 3 weeks away. I marked it on the calendar in red. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about my father's words. Protect your blood, Robert. Whatever it takes. I got up, pulled the lockbox from under the bed, and opened it. The inheritance papers glowed in the lamplight. I'd spent $50,000 so far. Legal fees, investigators, analysts. I'd spend every penny if I had to. Sarah appeared in the doorway, rubbing her eyes. Dad, you okay? I closed the box quickly. Yeah, honey. Just thinking. She sat on the edge of my bed. I'm scared. What if they win? What if the judge believes them? I took her hand. They won't win. I promise you, Sarah. They picked a fight with the wrong family. She hugged me tight. I don't know what I'd do without you. You're all I have left. I held her close. And over her shoulder, I stared at that lockbox. She had no idea. No idea that $9 million sat 10 feet away. No idea that her grandfather had planned for this exact scenario. And I'd keep it that way until the moment was right. 2 days before the hearing, I got a voicemail. Robert, this is Margaret Cole. Let's be reasonable. Drop the case, let the kids work it out. And we'll forget this whole mess. No lawyers, no courts. We're family now. Call me. I deleted it. We were never family. And after May 15th, we'd never have to see each other again. The morning of the hearing, I put on my best suit. Navy blue, the one I'd worn to Elizabeth's funeral 17 years ago. Sarah wore a simple black dress. We drove to the Woodford County Courthouse in silence. The building loomed ahead, stone and glass, American flag snapping in the wind. I parked in the lot and turned to her. You ready? She nodded, pale but determined. Let's finish this. We walked up those courthouse steps together. Inside, Elena was waiting with her briefcase and a confident smile. They have no idea what's about to hit them. I glanced across the lobby. Brandon and Margaret stood with their lawyer, a slick guy in an expensive suit. Brandon caught my eye and smirked. I didn't react. I just thought about that audio recording, those bank statements, that testimony from his ex-wife. And I smiled back. Courtroom number 3. Wood paneling, high ceilings, the kind of room that makes you feel the weight of justice. Judge Patricia Hendricks presiding, a no-nonsense woman in her mid-60s with steel-gray hair and reading glasses perched on her nose. I sat behind Elena at the petitioner's table. Sarah beside me. Hands folded in her lap. Across the aisle, Brandon sat with his lawyer, a guy named Dennis Cortland from some big firm in Omaha. Margaret was in the gallery behind them, arms crossed. Looking like she'd already won. The bailiff called the court to order. Judge Hendricks reviewed the case file, then looked up. This is a petition for dissolution of marriage filed by Sarah Mitchell Cole. Mr. Cole has filed a counterclaim seeking division of marital assets and family inheritance. Let's hear opening statements. Cortland stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. Your Honor. This is a simple case of abandonment. My client, Brandon Cole, entered into this marriage in good faith. 3 weeks later, Mrs. Cole fled the marital home without cause, refused reconciliation, and is now attempting to hide significant family assets inherited from her grandfather, George Mitchell. We have documentation proving that Mrs. Cole signed over rights to shared property before the marriage, which she is now unlawfully attempting to void. I felt Sarah tense beside me. Elena put a hand on her arm, steady and calm. Judge Hendricks made a note. Mrs. Vasquez, your response. Elena rose smoothly. Your Honor, what we have here is not a marriage. It's a premeditated fraud. Mr. Cole and his mother Margaret Cole conspired to defraud my client and her father of assets they believed existed. They bribed a notary public to forge documents, fabricated evidence of infidelity, and engaged in extortion. We have proof of all of it. And by the end of this hearing, the court will see that Mr. Cole deserves nothing but criminal charges. Cortland scoffed. Allegations without evidence, Your Honor. Elena smiled. Oh, we have evidence. The first witness was David Klein, the notary. He looked nervous, sweating in a cheap suit. Cortland walked him through his testimony. Mr. Klein, did you notarize a property transfer agreement signed by Sarah Cole on March 14, 2024? Klein nodded. Yes, I did. She came to my office, presented identification, and signed willingly. Cortland presented the document. Your Honor, Exhibit A. Notarized and sealed. Elena stood for cross-examination. Mr. Klein, were you a licensed notary public in the state of Iowa on March 14? Klein hesitated. Yes. Elena pulled out a paper. Your Honor, this is a record from the Iowa Secretary of State. Mr. Klein's notary license was suspended on February 28, 2024, for prior misconduct. He was not legally authorized to notarize anything in March. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Klein's face went white. Cortland jumped up. Objection, this document wasn't disclosed in discovery. Elena didn't blink. It's a public record, Your Honor. Available to anyone. Judge Hendricks frowned. Overruled. Continue, Mrs. Vasquez. Elena stepped closer to Klein. Mr. Klein. Did you receive $5,000 from Margaret Cole on March 10? Klein stammered. It was a loan. Elena slid a bank statement across. This shows a deposit of exactly $5,000 into your account on March 10. With the memo line reading notary services. That's not a loan, Mr. Klein. That's a bribe. Cortland objected again, but the judge shut him down. I want to hear this. Elena produced another document. Your Honor, we subpoenaed Mr. Klein's phone records. He received 14 calls from Brandon Cole and 6 from Margaret Cole in the 2 weeks before the wedding. All planning this fraud. Then came the knockout punch. Elena pulled out a small audio recorder and handed it to the bailiff. Your Honor, this is a recording obtained legally. Under Iowa's one-party consent law. Mr. Klein's secretary cooperated as a witness. The courtroom went silent as the recording played. Brandon's voice filled the room. Make it look official. Backdate the signature to March 14. We need it to hold up in court. Margaret's voice followed. 5 now, 5 after it's done. Just make sure it's notarized properly. The room erupted. Judge Hendricks slammed her gavel. Order. She glared at Cortland. Counselor, do you have an explanation for this? Cortland looked like he'd been hit by a truck. Your Honor, I was not aware of any. He trailed off. Brandon grabbed his arm, whispering frantically. The judge turned to Klein. Mr. Klein, you're excused from this witness stand, but don't leave the building. The bailiff will escort you to a holding room. I'm referring this matter to the district attorney's office for criminal investigation. Klein was led out, pale and shaking. Margaret's face was stone. Brandon stared at the table, jaw clenched. Elena wasn't done. We called Jennifer Holbrook. A woman in her late 30s entered the courtroom. She looked confident, composed. Elena guided her through her testimony. Mrs. Holbrook, were you previously married to Brandon Cole? Yes. From June 2020 to August 2021. 14 months. And why did the marriage end? Because I discovered he'd only married me for my family's money. When he found out my parents had cut me off financially, he filed for divorce and tried to claim half of a trust fund that didn't exist. He harassed my family. Made threats. I had to get a restraining order. Cortland objected. Relevance, Your Honor. This is character assassination. Judge Hendricks looked at Elena. Mrs. Vasquez. Elena replied calmly. It establishes a pattern, Your Honor. Mr. Cole has done this before. And we have records showing he did it to a second wife as well. Exhibit D, she handed over divorce records from another marriage, same pattern. Married 8 months, divorced when the money didn't materialize. The judge reviewed the documents, her expression darkening. Noted. Proceed. Next, Elena called Dr. Allen Chen, a forensic digital analyst. He testified about the photoshopped images Brandon had sent to intimidate us. These images were created on April 4, 2024, using Adobe Photoshop. The metadata is intact. The backgrounds are composites, and Mrs. Cole's face was digitally inserted. These are complete fabrications. Judge Hendricks examined the analysis. So these photos Mr. Cole submitted as evidence of adultery are fake? Dr. Chen nodded. Completely, Your Honor. By now, Cortland had stopped objecting. He sat slumped in his chair, whispering urgently with Brandon. Margaret had her face in her hands. The gallery was dead silent. Elena delivered the final blow. Your Honor, we also have Mr. Cole's internet search history, obtained through legal discovery from his laptop. She projected it onto a screen. Search terms included George Mitchell obituary, how to claim inheritance through marriage Iowa, and fastest way to divorce and keep assets. All dated before he even proposed to my client. The courtroom felt like the air had been sucked out. Judge Hendricks removed her glasses and stared at Brandon. Mr. Cole, stand up. Brandon stood slowly, his face red. In 30 years on the bench, I have seen a lot of things. But this level of premeditation, this calculated cruelty, is appalling. The petition for dissolution of marriage is granted. Mrs. Sarah Cole is awarded full dissolution with no asset division to Mr. Cole. Furthermore, I am issuing a restraining order prohibiting Mr. Cole and Margaret Cole from contacting Mrs. Cole or Mr. Mitchell. And I am referring this entire matter to the district attorney for charges of fraud, forgery, bribery, and attempted extortion. Bailiff, escort Mr. Cole and Mrs. Cole out of my courtroom. The bailiff stepped forward. Brandon exploded. This is insane. That old man is hiding millions. We have a right to it. Judge Hendricks banged her gavel. One more word and you'll be held in contempt. Remove them. As the bailiff led Brandon and Margaret out, Brandon turned and screamed at me. You think you won? You're nothing. Where's this fortune? Huh? You're just a broke old man. I sat there, calm, and said nothing. Because he still had no idea. No idea about the $9 million sitting in my lockbox. And he never would. The courtroom doors closed behind them. Judge Hendricks looked at Sarah. Mrs. Cole, you're free to reclaim your maiden name if you wish. Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. Thank you. Your Honor. We walked out of that courthouse into the bright May sunshine. Reporters were waiting, cameras flashing. Sarah held my arm tight. Elena shook my hand. Pleasure doing business with you. Bob. I nodded. Thank you. For everything. As we drove away, Sarah finally spoke. Dad, how did we afford all that? Elena, the investigator, the analyst. I glanced at her. Let's go home, honey. There's something I need to tell you. And for the first time in 6 months, I was ready to tell her the truth. Back at the house, I made us both coffee. Sarah sat on the couch, still in her black dress, exhausted but relieved. Dad, she said quietly, I need to know. How did you pay for all of that? Elena's retainer alone must have been $50,000. You're retired. You live on a pension. Where did the money come from? I set down my cup and walked to the bedroom. I could feel her watching me. When I came back, I was carrying the lockbox. I set it on the coffee table between us and opened it. Inside were the papers. Estate documents, investment portfolios, property deeds. And at the top, a letter in my father's handwriting. Sarah's eyes went wide. Dad, what is this? I took a breath. Your grandfather left me $9 million. Properties, stocks, bonds. Everything he built over 50 years. He passed in November, right before you met Brandon. The lawyer told me in December. I sat beside her. And I never told you. Her hand flew to her mouth. 9 million. Dad, why would you hide that from me? We struggled. You could have retired. Comfortably. We could have, her voice broke. Why? I handed her the letter. Read this. She unfolded it with shaking hands. The handwriting was unmistakable, our grandfather's careful script. Robert. Money doesn't build character. It reveals it. My own brother betrayed me for $50,000 in 1975. Smiled to my face, then forged my signature and emptied my account. I had to start over from nothing. I learned the hard way that when people know you have wealth, they see dollar signs, not family. Test Sarah's husband. If he loves her without knowing about the money, he's real. If he starts asking questions, digging around, you'll know he's a vulture. Protect her, son. Whatever it takes. Sarah read it twice, tears spilling onto the page. Grandpa knew. He knew this could happen. I nodded. He made me promise. The day he died, he held my hand and said, hide this until you know the truth. So I did. I watched Brandon at that first dinner. The way he looked at our neighborhood, the questions about property, the condescension. And at the wedding, I overheard him on the phone talking about accessing the estate. That's when I knew for sure. She looked up at me, eyes red. You let them call us poor. You let Margaret insult you, let Brandon treat you like you were nothing. All to protect me. I reached over and took her hand. I'd do it 1,000 times over. Because if Brandon had known about this money, he would have been smarter. He might have hidden his greed better, waited longer. We might not have caught him. But because he thought we had nothing, he got sloppy. Greedy. And that's what destroyed him. Sarah threw her arms around me and sobbed. I held her tight, the way I used to when she was little and had nightmares. I'm so sorry, Dad. I should have listened to you. I should have seen it. I stroked her hair. You loved him. There's no shame in that. You have a good heart, Sarah. Don't ever lose that. We sat there for a long time, the afternoon sun streaming through the windows. Finally, she pulled back and looked at the papers again. So what now? What do we do with all this? I smiled. This is yours, honey. Your future. A house, if you want one. Security. College funds for kids someday. Whatever you need. But more than the money, your grandpa left you a lesson. Character matters. More than wealth. And you've got character, Sarah. You stood up to Brandon. You fought back. Your grandpa would be so proud. She wiped her eyes. Can we go see him? His grave? I want to thank him. Absolutely. We drove to Greenwood Cemetery that evening. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the headstones. We stood together at George's grave, and Sarah placed a bouquet of wildflowers on the stone. Thank you, Grandpa, she whispered. You protected us even after you were gone. I love you. The wind rustled through the trees, and for a moment, I felt him there again. Watching over us, the way he always had. 2 weeks later, the news broke. Brandon Cole and Margaret Cole sentenced to 18 months in federal prison for fraud, forgery, and bribery. Brandon's real estate license was permanently revoked. Their names were all over the local papers. The Sioux City Journal ran a front-page story. The fallout was brutal. Brandon lost his job. His reputation, everything. Margaret's business collapsed. And Sarah? She got her maiden name back. Sarah Mitchell. She found a new apartment downtown, started a new job at a nonprofit helping domestic abuse survivors. Every Sunday, we'd meet for breakfast at the same diner on Gordon Drive. And every time, she'd smile at me across the table and say, "Thanks for never giving up on me, Dad." I'd smile back. That's what family does. And that $9 million. It's still sitting in the bank, earning interest, waiting for the day Sarah needs it. But the real inheritance, the one that mattered, wasn't the money. It was the lesson. Protect your blood. Trust your gut. And never let anyone make you feel small, no matter how much noise they make. My father taught me that. And now, Sarah knows it too. So what's the lesson here? It's simple, but it's one I'll carry for the rest of my life. Wisdom isn't about how much money you have. It's about knowing when to hide it and when to use it. My father understood something most people don't. Wealth doesn't reveal your character. It reveals everyone else's. If I'd told Sarah about that $9 million right away, Brandon would have played the long game. He would have been patient, convincing, maybe even loving. We might never have seen his true face until it was too late, until he'd locked her into a legal trap we couldn't escape. But by staying quiet, by appearing to have nothing, I gave him enough rope to hang himself. And he did. There's another lesson too, one for any parent watching this. Trust your gut. I knew something was wrong with Brandon from day one. The arrogance, the questions, the way he looked at people like they were beneath him. My daughter didn't see it because she was in love. But I saw it. And instead of forcing her to choose between me and him, I stayed close, stayed patient, and waited for the truth to show itself. Sometimes the best way to protect the people you love is to let them learn the hard way, but be ready to catch them when they fall. And here's the thing. That $9 million. It's still there. I've barely touched it. Because the real treasure wasn't the money. It was keeping my daughter safe. It was honoring my father's legacy. It was proving that loyalty, patience, and strategy will always beat greed. If this story resonated with you, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another story. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever had to protect someone you love from a toxic relationship? Have you ever had to hide something important to reveal someone's true character? I read every single comment, and I'd love to hear your stories. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, someone dealing with a manipulative partner or family member, share this video. You might just save them from making a costly mistake. Next time, I'll share another revenge story. That'll remind you, justice doesn't always come from the courtroom. Sometimes it comes from being smarter, quieter, and more prepared than your enemies. Until then, remember, protect your blood. Trust your instincts, and never let anyone make you feel small. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.